The note I left was 3 characters in simplified Chinese, written on a hotel notepad in handwriting my mother would have recognized, and I slipped it under the door of Suite 1403 at 11:47 at night and walked back to my housekeeping cart and rode the elevator down to the laundry room and went home. The 3 characters meant, *, your gift is an insult. I'll explain what gift, and why, and what made a hotel housekeeper the one person in that building who could read what was happening in Suite 1403 that week. But first I want you to know the shape of the note itself, because the shape matters. 3 characters, simplified script, no signature, slipped under a door. The smallest possible intervention, the minimum viable correction, from a person who had no official standing in that negotiation and no channel through which to make herself heard by anyone in it. The minimum viable correction, and it was enough. That's the whole lesson, actually. I'm going to spend the next while telling you why it was enough, and the answer is not what most people would assume. My name is Celeste Kebi. I was not fired. What happened instead was that the deal that would have collapsed under the weight of a cultural misread didn't collapse. What happened was that a man named Wei Junhao spent 3 days trying to find the person who'd written 3 characters on hotel stationery, because those characters had turned a negotiation that was hours from disaster into the beginning of the most successful joint venture his company had signed in a decade. What happened was that when he found me, when he walked into the hotel lobby on a Thursday morning and the concierge pointed at the woman pushing the linen cart by the east elevator bank, he stopped walking and looked at me for a long time, and I looked back at him, and then he said, in Mandarin, "How long have you known?" And I said, in Mandarin, "Since the 2nd day." And the look on his face is the closest thing to a mirror I've ever held up to my own life, because it was the look of a man who has just understood that the room he thought he was alone in had someone else in it the whole time. I know that look. I've been on the other side of it more times than I can count. I've made a career, of a kind, of being that someone else. Let me tell you the whole story, because the 3 characters are only the end of it, and the beginning is where it actually gets interesting. My name is Celeste Kebi. I'm 29 years old, and for 14 months I worked as a hotel housekeeper at the Grand Meridian in the financial district. And before that I spent 6 years as a corporate translator and cultural consultant specializing in Mandarin English negotiations. And before that I spent 4 years at a university studying exactly that. And before any of that, I was the daughter of a Nigerian professor and a Taiwanese-American linguist who raised me speaking 3 languages before I was 7, and who put a jade ring on my right hand when I turned 20 that I wore, at the Grand Meridian, under a latex cleaning glove. So that's who was pushing the linen cart. I want you to have that picture before the story goes anywhere else. Why was she pushing the linen cart? That's the question, right? That's the first question everybody asks. Before the deal, before the note, before Wei Junhao tracked me down, the only interesting question is why a woman with that particular background was cleaning hotel rooms in the financial district, and the answer is both simpler and more complicated than it looks. The simple version: I left the industry. After 6 years of corporate translation work, I left deliberately and by choice because I'd watched the industry long enough to see what it did to the people in it, and I had a plan that required a specific kind of understanding that I couldn't get from the inside, and the plan required me to be on the outside for a while. The complicated version: my mother died. 18 months before I took the housekeeping job, my mother died. And when your mother dies, and she was the person who gave you your languages and your ear and your understanding of the invisible architecture that runs between cultures, when you lose the person who was the whole origin of the thing you'd built your career on, you need to sit with that for a while in a place where nobody needs the thing she gave you, where you can carry it without being asked to deploy it, where it's yours and quiet and unmined. I'll tell you what the 6 years looked like, so you understand what the plan was reacting against. I worked for 2 firms. The first, a mid-sized translation house that mostly did legal and pharmaceutical work, precise and underpaid and invisible. The second, a boutique advisory that did high-stakes cross-border negotiations, where I was one of 3 Mandarin specialists, and where the credit for the work flowed in one direction, which was upward, toward the partners who presented the analysis to the clients and whose names were on the engagement letters. I was good at the work. I was very good at it, in the specific way that my mother had trained me to be good at it. Not just the words, but the underneath the words, the part that you need 18 years of immersion to hear, and that cannot be learned from a textbook or a course, or even a second language degree, which I also had. I was the best reader in that firm of what was actually happening in a room. I was the 3rd name on the billing sheet and the 1st name on none of the client deliverables, and after 6 years I understood that the structural arrangement of the industry was not going to change to accommodate me, and that I had 2 choices, which were to stay and rise slowly within the structure by acquiring the kind of standing the structure rewarded, or to leave and build the thing that the structure couldn't see it was missing. I chose to leave. And then my mother died. And the plan, which had been a plan for building something, became also a plan for grieving, and the housekeeping job was where those 2 things overlapped. The Grand Meridian was where I went to be invisible for a reason, and to fill the notebook, and to wear the jade ring under the glove where it was mine and no one else's. The plan, which I am now at a point in my life where I can describe without sounding like a romantic or a fool, was this. I wanted to start my own firm. Not a translation firm, not a consulting firm in the ordinary sense. A cultural intelligence firm, the kind that doesn't just translate words but translates the space between the words, the unspoken hierarchies and gift economies and face-saving protocols that billion-dollar deals live and die inside of, and that the people running those deals almost never understand until something has already gone wrong. The field exists in fragments. There are cultural advisors who work as adjuncts to deal teams. There are translators who pick up patterns over years. There are anthropologists who write about this from the outside. But nobody had built what I wanted to build, which was a strategic practice that sat at the table rather than behind it, that built at the rate of the analysis rather than the translation, and that put the person who understood the invisible architecture in the room as a peer rather than a service.
And
I had 6 years of watching deals fail in exactly that space. I had 3 languages and an ear trained since childhood and a notebook that was filling with patterns I'd never seen documented anywhere, because the people who understood them had been trained to be translators, which meant their insight was always mediated by someone else's authority. The partner who presented the analysis, the executive who owned the client relationship, the person whose name was on the letter. I had the analysis, I needed the standing, and I needed to build a case that was irrefutable before I tried to stand anywhere. The most direct route to that was not to write about it or study it further or find a mentor in the industry who would advocate for me, which was not a fast route and was not a reliable one. It was to be in the rooms where the invisible architecture was actually operating, until I knew it well enough and had documented it specifically enough that the case made itself. The Grand Meridian's housekeeping staff, in the financial district, for 14 months, that was the route I chose. That's who the maid was. That's what she was doing with her notepad and her very good memory. Every shift, in a hotel in the financial district where 9 out of 10 deal conversations eventually happened in a room she cleaned. I should tell you about the job itself, because the job was real, and it was work, and I don't want you to think I was above it, because I wasn't, and I don't want you to think it was a performance, because it wasn't that either. Housekeeping is one of the most physically demanding things I have ever done, full stop, without qualification. My feet by the end of every shift were the feet of a person who'd walked 12 miles on hard floors. The work of making a room look as though it hadn't been lived in by real humans is a more precise and effortful craft than most people who use those rooms will understand in their entire lives. I was good at it, genuinely, in the same way I was good at other things that required attention to detail and the patience to do the same careful thing many times without letting the repetition degrade the care. The women I worked with were extraordinary, funny and direct and ferociously competent, several of them managing households and extended families and second jobs on the other side of shifts that would have put most people on the floor. I wasn't performing invisibility in that job. I was working it. The notebook I kept was not about those women. It was about the rooms, and the rooms were never theirs. Which brings me to the second day of the Way delegation, which is when I first understood what was happening. The Grand Meridian had a suite arrangement that the international business guests used for the combination of hospitality and working sessions that high-stakes negotiations require, the kind of deal week where the parties have flown 12 time zones and are being wined and dined in the American manner, which is warm and generous and almost entirely incompatible with how the other parties actually make trust, which is slowly and through a series of encoded signals that Americans tend to interpret as inefficiency. I'd cleaned up after many of these. I'd developed a fluent understanding of which negotiations were going well and which were going badly by the arrangement of the room afterward, where the business cards were, how the glasses had been drunk from, what the food situation was, whether the seating had been maintained or abandoned. On the first day of the Way delegation's visit, the room looked fine. On the second day, it looked like a room in which something had started to go wrong. I knew because of the cards. In the specific tradition I'd been trained to read since childhood, business cards are not incidental. They are an extension of the person presenting them and the way they are received, with both hands, a moment of attention, placed carefully on the table and read before anything else happens, is a communication about whether the receiver understands this. The American hosting team had received the Way delegation's cards one-handed, glanced at them, and stacked them under a notepad. I could tell from the positions when I cleaned the room afterward. The notepad was theirs, the stack was under it, the cards were face down, which is the specific orientation of an object you've been done with. To anyone on the Way side who'd been in that room, and they were all watching, because this is what you watch when you're deciding whether the people across the table are worth trusting. This was not simply an American not knowing a custom. Ignorance of a custom is neutral. What the card handling communicated, in the compressed and precise language of these interactions, was a more specific thing. Asterisk, we are not treating this as a relationship to be built, which is also, in this tradition, a statement about what the deal is, not a partnership, an acquisition dressed in partnership language. That was day 2. By day 3, the seating arrangements had shifted in a way I'd seen in 2 previous negotiations at this hotel that had eventually dissolved, the Way delegation clustering on their side of the table rather than distributing around it, which is the physical language of a group that has decided to close ranks. And day 3 was when the gift happened. The hosting team's coordinator had set up a gift display on the side table of the suite, a decorative box of crystal objects and a bundle of promotional materials for the American company, wrapped in white tissue paper and green ribbon, and she'd asked me to arrange the display while she took a call because I happened to be in the room turning down the bed. White is the color of mourning in Chinese tradition. In the specific regional and business cultural context I'd spent 6 years learning in the field, green ribbon in the context of a corporate gift can communicate something about the giver's intentions that the giver in this case had absolutely no knowledge of communicating. The promotional materials were for a subsidiary the Wei delegation had specifically noted in their opening document that they did not wish to absorb, a document that the hosting team had clearly received and not read closely. A funeral-colored bundle of reminders of the thing the other party had already said no to. As gifts go, this one was so comprehensively wrong that it had almost a structural elegance to it. I arranged the display as I'd been asked. I noted it in my notebook. I went back to my cart, and that night I couldn't sleep. That night at 11:47 I couldn't sleep. I lay in my apartment, which is a thing that happens when you have a mother who raised you inside the invisible architecture and you watch the invisible architecture blow something up. I thought about 6 years of watching deals die in exactly this way. I thought about what would happen to the Wei delegation when they opened that gift in the morning. The specific thing that would solidify in the room, the Wei trust that was already fragile would become rigid and then break. I thought about the American hosting team, who were not bad people, who were genuinely interested in this deal, who would have no idea why the morning session would go cold, and would spend 3 weeks in follow-up calls that went nowhere trying to diagnose something they didn't have the vocabulary to diagnose. And I thought about my notebook. I want to stop here and tell you something true because this is the choice the story is really about, and I don't want to glide past it. I could have said nothing. What I knew was professionally mine. It had come from my own background and training, not from anything I was supposed to report. The hosting company wasn't my employer. The hotel was. The negotiation was not my business. And I had a plan, a careful plan, built around the idea that the knowledge I was accumulating was going to fund my firm, and using a piece of it for free on an overheard deal was not in the plan. But I'd watched my mother translate. Not just words, she translated the way sound moves between cultures, the frequencies underneath language that people trained to a specific culture can hear and that other people cannot, and she spent her whole career using that hearing in service of other people's conversations. She worked for the State Department for 15 years, then for a private firm. And in all those years I watched people use her ear and put their names on the conclusions. She was too gracious about it. That grace was a form of modesty my mother had that I decided, early in my career, was not a trait I was going to inherit from her, because I'd watched it cost her too much. But the other thing I'd watched, the thing that stayed, was that she never in 30 years saw a plane fly into a mountain and said nothing. The words are never the hardest part, she used to say. The hardest part is that you can hear the mountain and they cannot. Once you can hear it, you cannot unhear it, and once you've heard it, silence makes you complicit in the crash. Yarm. So, the mountain was white paper and green ribbon on a table in Suite 1403. The plane was a $2 billion deal. The person who could hear it was me, in my uniform, with her jade ring under my glove. I took out the hotel notepad from my cart. I wrote 3 characters. I folded the paper. I went to Suite 1403 and I slipped it under the door. And then I went home and waited to be fired. And I held the ring through the latex glove all the way down in the elevator, because it was the closest I could get, that night, to my mother. Before I tell you what happened the next morning in the Meridian Suite, and what happened in that suite turned out to be the beginning of 2 years of something I still can't describe as anything except exactly what I'd set out to build, except arrived at from a direction I never expected. I want to ask you something, and I mean it because it's the real question under all of this. Have you ever had a skill, a piece of knowledge, a thing you knew how to hear that other people couldn't and made yourself small around it? Not because you were ashamed of it, but because the world around you hadn't yet made a space for it. Have you ever been in the room where your real self was the one under the glove, and the one people saw was the glove? Have you ever been building something in the margins of the visible life, in the notebook that nobody knows about, in the hours that don't belong to the job you're being paid for? I'd like to hear about it in the comments, because that's what this story is actually about, and I read every one. Subscribe and stay, because the reason I'm telling this story is that the ending is the one I couldn't have planned, and it's about what happens when the glove comes off at the right moment, instead of the wrong one.
In the morning, the gift was not presented.
Wei Junhao had received my note at midnight, and he'd read it again, and then he'd woken his head of protocol, a woman named Chen Mei, who had confirmed what I'd written and added several things I hadn't said, because Chen Mei had been watching the card situation and the seating situation and the document situation since day one, and had been compiling her own version of the same case I'd made in 3 characters. The gift was quietly redirected and a different arrangement was made, and the morning session opened not in the atmosphere of funeral and betrayal that it would have, but in a slightly different atmosphere, and the slightly different atmosphere was enough. The deal didn't close that week. Deals like this don't close in a week, but the week didn't collapse, which is what the week had been scheduled to do, and the conversations continued, and eventually the deal closed, And when it did, it closed as a genuine partnership rather than the acquisition dressed as partnership that it would have been if the week had gone the way it was going. I know this because Wei Junhyo told me, 11 months later, when the announcement was made and he flew back to give me a document I will get to in a moment. He knew it was someone on the hotel staff. The note was on hotel stationery, delivered at 11:47 p.m., which is after room service ends and before the overnight shift turns over. A narrow window accessible to housekeeping. The handwriting was clean and confident, not hurried. The handwriting of someone who wrote in simplified Chinese regularly rather than someone who'd looked up the characters. The simplified script itself was the detail that narrowed the field most. Mandarin learners of the kind the hotel might conceivably have employed almost universally write traditional characters, because traditional is what Western language curricula teach. Someone who'd written simplified with that fluency had learned inside the mainland curriculum or had been specifically trained in it for professional reasons. He asked the hotel's guest services manager whether any member of the housekeeping staff on his floor had a background in Chinese language. The manager asked around. The answer that came back was that no housekeeping staff members, to the hotel's knowledge, had such a background. They were right, technically. My hiring paperwork listed my previous employment as freelance language services, which was accurate. My education was listed as a bachelor's in linguistics, also accurate, without further detail. Nobody at the hotel had ever asked me to elaborate, and I had never volunteered anything, because the glove was on and the ring was under it, and the job was the job. So Wei Junhyo did the thing I've since come to understand is characteristic of him, which is that he went and looked himself, rather than accepting the summary. He came back to the hotel on Thursday morning and told the concierge he'd left an item in his suite and would like to speak with whoever had serviced that floor the night before. The concierge pointed at the woman pushing the linen cart by the east elevator bank. I heard his footsteps crossing the lobby. Hotel lobbies have a particular acoustic, and in 14 months I had learned the sound of every category of person crossing them. The hurried guest, the unhurried guest, the person who knows where they're going, the person who's looking. These were the footsteps of a person who had found what they were looking for and was crossing to it directly. I looked up. Here is what I remember about that look. Not the surprise, I'd expected the surprise, and it was there, and I'd imagined it enough times that it was almost familiar. But the thing underneath it, which was a quality of attention I recognized from my mother's face when she heard something she needed to remember. He was updating, not just his understanding of me, his understanding of the entire situation, the note, the timing, the 3 characters in simplified script, what it meant that the person who'd written it was standing here in this uniform having been standing here for 14 months. He was running the calculation forward, and I could see the calculation running, because I'd spent years watching that calculation run in other faces. How long have you known? He said, in Mandarin, which is what you say when you've already completed the inference and the question is just the confirmation. Since the second day, I said, in Mandarin. I took off the right glove, not slowly, not dramatically, reached up and peeled it back the way you take off a glove after work. The jade ring on my right hand was in the lobby light of the Grand Meridian Hotel in the financial district, and it is an old ring, an old jade in an old setting. And the color of it is not the green that comes to mind when you say the word green. It is the specific green that a certain tradition has assigned a certain meaning to. And Wei Junhyo was from a province where people understand what that ring means when it is on a woman's right hand, and I watched him understand it. Not the financial meaning, the other one. He looked at the ring for a moment. Then he said, "Will you have coffee with me?" That wasn't a question. "Let me put the card away," I said. We had coffee for 3 hours in the hotel's lobby cafe, which is a place I had served coffee in for 14 months and had never sat in as a customer. And there was a particular quality to that inversion that I noticed without commenting on. I told him who I was and what I'd been doing and why, in the same direct way I'd been training myself to tell my own story as a business proposition rather than an autobiography. Here is the background, here is the plan, here is where the note fits into it, here is what I've been building. He listened in the way I'd already noticed he listened, which was thoroughly and without performance, the listening of a person who is genuinely trying to understand the structure of something rather than finding the moment to respond. When I described the 6 years in the industry and why I'd left, he nodded once. When I described what I'd documented at the hotel, not the specific conversations, the patterns, the repeating architecture of how deals failed in the space between languages, he asked 2 questions, both precise, both the questions that someone who understood what I was describing would ask. When I told him about my mother, and the jade ring, and why the note hadn't been a business decision, I watched his face register something that wasn't pity and wasn't sympathy. It was closer to recognition, the look of a man who has also lost a person who was the origin of something and has had to carry the thing forward without them. "Huh," he said, when I'd finished. The 3 characters. You chose simplified script. Because you would. You're from Hunan. He looked at me steadily. Most people who've studied Mandarin would have written traditional. I know. That's why I chose simplified. So you'd know it wasn't a textbook. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you are a significant person who has been choosing to be invisible. I'm curious why you trusted the note to a stranger before you trusted yourself to a job that uses you. I'd been thinking about how to answer that question for 3 hours in the lobby cafe, and the answer I'd arrived at was the true one. Because the note was for the deal, the job is for me. He understood that. I watched him understand it, the way you watch someone solve an equation, the components clicking into a structure that makes sense. Then he said, "What do you need to build what you're building?" I gave him a number. He didn't flinch. I gave him a client profile, what I needed the first client to look like, what the engagement had to demonstrate, what I needed to have on the record before I could approach the rest of the market. He listened to all of it without taking a note, which told me he had a better memory than he needed to perform. Then he said he had a second American negotiation beginning in 4 months, more complex than the current one, that had already identified the gap I was describing as the gap, and that his team had been looking for exactly the kind of coverage I was offering and had not found it, and that if I was willing to work it as a named pilot under my own terms, he would attach his name to the deliverable. I did not say yes that afternoon. I've told you this already, but I want to tell you why, because the why is the part that's harder to say. I didn't say yes because I'd spent 6 years saying yes in rooms where the credit went upward, and I'd learned that the terms you said at the beginning are the terms you live in, and the terms that sounded generous at the beginning were frequently the terms that looked different later. I said I'd send him a proposal. He said he'd look forward to reading it. The proposal I sent was 8 pages. It specified deliverables, timeline, my name on the joint report, attribution requirements, the right to reference the engagement in my own materials with his written agreement on what could be referenced, payment structure, and the exit conditions under which I would terminate the engagement if certain conditions weren't met. I sent it without apology, because my mother had spent 30 years being apologetic about what she knew, and I had watched that apology cost her things it should not have cost her, and I had made a different decision about how I was going to carry what she gave me. Wei Junhao wrote back in 4 hours. Asterisk agreed on all points. When can you start? The firm is 2 years old. It has 7 clients, 3 of whom found me because of Wei Junhao's name attached to the first project. His name is a specific kind of currency in the circles where the work is needed, and 4 of whom found me through the work itself, which is the better kind of track record. The kind built on what you actually produced rather than who endorsed you. The work is what my mother described in a sentence she said to me so many times it's now just part of how I think. The words are never the hardest part. The hardest part is the architecture underneath the words, the gift that shouldn't have been white, the card that was placed face down, the seating arrangement that says we've already decided. The hardest part is that this architecture is invisible to the people most affected by it, which means they can't identify what's going wrong, which means they can't fix it, which means they lose deals they could have won, and build resentments that calcify into broken partnerships, all for the want of a person in the room who speaks the underneath the words. And that's the firm, that's what it does. Nobody had built it quite the way I've built it, because the people who had the ear for it had been socialized into the industry in ways that kept them in translator roles, which are service roles, which are roles where you report upward and the analysis flows to the person who owns the relationship. My insight was not that I was better at the work, it was that the work was being structurally misapplied, and that the right structure was to put the person who understood the invisible architecture at the table, instead of behind the table, as an analyst and strategist rather than a translator, and to charge accordingly for that positioning. Wei Junhao was the first person who paid for that positioning because he was smart enough to understand what he was buying. He was not the last. My mother's ring is on my right hand every day, in the air. The jade is not green, exactly. It's the color of something old and considered and chosen, and what it means is that the thing she gave me didn't end when she did. Here is what I want to leave you with, because it's the thing I've been turning over since the lobby, and I think it's different from what most people take out of a story like this. The world is full of stories about invisible people who turn out to be important. The structure of them is almost always the same. The invisible person gets seen, and being seen is what changes their life. And the implicit lesson is that you were right to wait until the right person looked, because until then, you couldn't do anything. The reveal is the whole story. The hiding is just the before. That's not what happened to me. I wasn't hiding. I was building. The time in the uniform wasn't the suffering before the vindication. It was a specific, chosen, purposeful phase of the plan, and the plan would have reached its destination by some route regardless of whether Wei Junhao came back to the hotel. He was the moment, but the moment was possible because the work had already been done. The notebook existed before he walked through the door. The analysis existed before he looked at the ring. If he hadn't come back, some other first client would have arrived eventually, through some other door, and when they arrived the notebook would have been there waiting, and so would I. The thing that mattered was not that he found me. The thing that mattered was that when he did, I knew exactly what I was worth, and I had the terms ready, and I said them without apology. That's the whole skill. Not the hiding and not the reveal, the knowing, the clear-headed knowledge of your own value, so that when the moment comes you are not negotiating from the place of someone who has been waiting to be saved. You're negotiating from the place of someone who was building the whole time and is now, simply, ready. My mother used to say that language is what people think is the tool, But what it's actually carrying is the understanding underneath it, the thing that words are only the surface of. You can have perfect fluency and still hear nothing. You can have imperfect fluency and hear everything. What you hear is a function of how much of the world you've decided to pay attention to. And you can decide to pay attention to more of the world than anyone around you expects, at any moment, in any room, regardless of what you're wearing or what you're carrying or what they've written on your name badge. You are not the glove. You are the ring. And the ring doesn't stop being what it is just because it's under rubber. It is also why I told him the deal story, rather than the mother story, when he asked why I'd left the industry. The mother story is mine. The deal story is the business. I've learned to know the difference, which is one of the things 6 years and a grief and 14 months of housekeeping taught me. Your story and your value proposition are related, but they are not the same thing, and conflating them in a high-stakes conversation is a form of imprecision you cannot afford. He got the deal story. The mother story belongs to me, and to you, now, because this is a different kind of room. The gloves are in a drawer somewhere. I don't think about them. What I think about is my mother's ring in the air, which is where it belongs, and the notebook that's now a business, and the woman in the lobby cafe who knew her terms before she sat down. That's who I was building while nobody was looking. Now you know. Tell me in the comments, who are you building?